Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. This is Josh Woolley, and on behalf of PCI, I'd like to welcome you all to today's GovCon 101 covering government property, and joined by our expert instructor, Christine Wade. Before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping announcements. Those of you new to our GovCon 101, we will be covering all the slides before we take any questions, but we do invite all questions at any time. We will also have a few polling questions at the conclusion. If you are seeking credit, make sure you guys stick to the end, complete those polling questions. They are necessary if you are seeking credit for today's session. In addition to polling questions, if you are seeking certificates, you guys will log into your account on our website and complete the survey. If you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know, and I will be more than happy to help you with that. With that, I thank you all very much for joining. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Chris. Let me know if you guys have any questions through the questions tab. It is located at the top right of your GoToWebinar, and that is where we will process any communication. With that, I'll hand it over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh Woolley. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Government Property 101. Today, we're going to touch on Part 45 of the FAR and provide an overview regarding government property. Part 45 specifically speaks to government property. So we're going to talk about the difference between government furnished property and contractor acquired property. We're going to talk about the key elements that are in the FAR regarding property management and the requirements for contractors and the government. We'll address the government property life cycle, and we'll also talk about the different treatment of government property based on contract type, talking about title and also transfer of government property. And as Josh Woolley said, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them into the chat. She'll be collecting them, and then we can discuss them at the end of the course today. Okay, so what is government property? There's two main buckets of government property. Government property is frequently referenced as a general overarching category, a parent, if you will, to both government furnished property and also contractor acquired property. So the general reference to government property means all property that's loaned or leased to the government. So it means title in some way is going to vest with and transfer to the government if it's not already owned by the government. It includes material, equipment, special tooling, special test equipment, all forms of property, both contractor acquired and also furnished. So the main difference between government furnished property, frequently referred to as GFP, sometimes people refer to it as GFE, government furnished equipment, and contractor acquired property, sometimes also referred to as CAM, contractor acquired material, or CAE, contractor acquired equipment. Again, all those designations are all subsumed under these two main categories. Government furnished property is property that the government has, that they already have title to, and they furnish it or provision it to a contractor for use on a specific contract. So the government has the property, they'll include it in your contract either at the time of award or as a contract mod, and then they will transfer the property in whatever form it is. It could be material, it could be equipment, special tooling, special test equipment, whatever it might be. The government gives this property to the contractor for use on a specific contract. So typically this is done without any cost to the contractor, and the contractor receives the property and then is a steward of the property that's furnished to it. Contractor acquired property means that the contractor purchases some sort of property, materials, it could be consumables, it could be equipment, tooling, whatever it might be, using funds from that contract, and at the time in which they are reimbursed, title to that property is going to vest with the government. So that means the government will eventually own this property that the contractor has purchased using the funds on that contract. So the main difference is the way the contractor comes into possessing the property, whether it's furnished by the government to the contractor or whether the contractor purchases it with the intent of the government owning it at the end of the contract. Now, within these two camps of property, furnished property and acquired property, there's really two main buckets. It's either expendable property or it's non-expendable. And what that means is some property that you come into possession, particularly materials, a lot of times those are consumable. And what that means is that the material is either consumed or incorporated into a higher end item during the course of its use on the contract. And so it has no unique identification after the completion of use of that particular material. Non-expendable property is property that is not consumed in use and that retains its unique identification. You can think of it in terms of, you might need to purchase hydrogen in support of a particular contract in the manufacturing of a particular product or a chemical processing. That hydrogen will be used during the course of the contract, so it's expendable. It's not going to retain its unique characteristics. Non-expendable items are things such as a laptop. It's going to be a laptop in the beginning, it's going to be a laptop in the end. A lot of times non-expendable items are serialized, so they have serial numbers that are attached to them or unique identification that they're going to retain throughout the course of the contract and thereafter. Machinery frequently or equipment is non-expendable. Now, durable is a form of property that's ordinarily would be considered expendable. However, because of its unique properties and characteristics, it has book value accountability. So non-expendable property means that it requires accountability throughout the property lifecycle. And what that means is during the course of your contract, you have to maintain an inventory, the location, who's checked out the item, whose possession it's in, where the item is. You need to have full accountability of that property, both in terms of physical records and then also location. Expendable property, for example, the hydrogen example, that's going to be consumed. So once it's consumed, it no longer has book value accountability. Durable property would be a kind of property that would ordinarily be considered expendable, either because it's very, very inexpensive, less than $50, or its useful life is less than a year. That's another characteristic of expendable property. Durable property, though, is considered accountable because it has a unique identification that will retain its characteristics after that first year. A great example of durable property would be a hammer. A hammer might only cost $15 or $20. However, it has a useful life of more than a year, and because of that, it is considered durable, meaning it's going to retain its characteristics and can be used in the future. So some items, when they're marked durable with a D, they require book value accountability because they do have that longevity that extends beyond a year. So now that we understand the two main buckets of government property, contractor acquired property and government furnished property, I want to go through the FAR and what the definitions, the policies, the responsibilities for both the government and the contractor are with regards to government property, also the assessment process of your business system. Government property is one of the main 6 business systems that are audited by DCMA. We're going to talk about transferring accountability of government property, and also we're going to touch on a couple of contract clauses. So it's the policy in the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, that contractors, when they bid on work, respond to a solicitation, they are required to furnish all property necessary to fulfill the requirements of that contract. So the provisioning of government furnished property should be kind of what you might think as a last resort. And because of that, there are certain requirements that the government has to identify and specifically support if they are going to provision government property on a contract at all. And those four items is that it has to clearly be in the best interest of the government to allow for contract to acquire property or furnished property to be used in support of the contract. The overall benefit of having property on that contract has to outweigh the actual cost of administratively monitoring the property, conducting the assessments, the audits, tracking it, and all the bookkeeping associated with it. It cannot increase the government's risk by having government property on that particular contract, and the requirements of the contract would simply not be able to be met if not for either the furnishing of government property or the acquisition of the property on the contract. So these are the four main items that have to be addressed in order for you to have any kind of property on a particular government contract. And these are the four items that the government will go ahead and document and support if they're going to allow provisioning of property on federal contracts. Now, generally, the government's position with regards to your property management system, so I use small s system, the system meaning the people, the processes, the technology, the tools that you use to monitor property in your possession, report on property in your possession, do inventories, the entire system itself that governs the property that is in your possession. The government doesn't have a particular requirement that says you have to use this system or you have to use these tools. And it allows contractors to rely on what's called voluntary consensus standards. And so a lot of times that looks towards industry associations or nonprofit associations or industry best practices to rely on whatever the best practices are in industry in order to maintain that system. And for government property, some of those are the ANSI requirements and then also the National Property Management Association. These are both industry associations and a group of regulatory standards that are independently operated that provide kind of the equivalent of best practices for government property or property in general and asset management in across industry, particularly with a heavy focus on manufacturing as well. And so the government agencies will not require a contractor to create a separate property management system that's different than the property management system you might already have in your possession. If you are a manufacturer, the idea of inventory and asset management, you're not going to be a stranger to that. And you likely have a system already established with which to track and maintain those stores. And so the government says you can absolutely use that system in order to comply with the Part 45 government property requirements. They just provide additional requirements in terms of the audit criteria and the 22 elements of the property management system that you're required to address. So you can use the system you currently have, and a lot of times if you're new into the government arena, you'll just have to add on to that property management system the additional requirements or address the additional requirements that are in the government audit program so that you comply with the 22 elements of the government property management system assessment. So the contractor's property management system are required to comply with contractual requirements. So you have to comply with the requirements in your contract, which typically are going to include your property management clause. We'll talk about those in a little bit. You also have to be able to periodically comply with the analysis and assessment of your government property management plan. So your plan is the equivalent of your policies and procedures for your property management system. And the government's responsibility, the PA, the property administrator, is required to review your property management plan, and if it is not compliant, notify a contractor when their plan, when their system is in non-compliance, identify those deficiencies, and request that the contractor create a corrective action plan so that they can remediate those deficiencies and prevent them from reoccurring in the future. (45)106 talks about transferring accountability of government property. And government property cannot be transferred without a contractual action. So government property can only be transferred from one contract to another when there's a firm requirement that exists, and those 4 criteria that we talked about in the policy in 45.102 are identified. And also, both contracts need a modification. So the gaining and losing contract would need to be modified. When you transfer property from one contract to another, if the property originated as CAP, contractor acquired property, on the originating contract that's losing the property, when it's transferred to another contract, it then transfers and becomes government furnished property. And the idea is that whether the contractor acquired property is physically delivered to the government and then redelivered onto another contract, or whether it's virtually transferred and then modified and transferred to the gaining contract, any CAP that existed is then government furnished property once it is transferred to that receiving or gaining contract. And so that's an important characteristic to understand, that once the government takes accountability and accepts receipt of contractor acquired property, if it is then reissued, when it is reissued, it will always be reissued as government furnished property, even if it's within the same contractor. So let's talk about contract clauses. If there is a requirement for government property on a contract, or if there's the potential for contractor acquired property to be on a contract or property to be furnished at a later date, you're typically going to find your basic government contract property clause in that contract award. And that's your 52-245-1 clause. And this clause is binding upon both the government and also the contractor. It's used in all cost reimbursement, T&M, and labor hour type solicitations. It's used on fixed price solicitations and contracts. It's also used on Part 12 commercial item procurements. So really, it's almost any contract that's going to have any kind of property, whether furnished or acquired, it will have this basic clause in it. And the guidance for when to use that clause is specifically found in Part 45.107A of the FAR. And so in this clause, it provides a definition of government property. It provides information about the property management system and what the requirements for those systems are. It provides regulation and control of the use of government property, when it can be used and when it cannot. It speaks directly to government furnished property. It talks to reporting and inventory disposal methods, and it also speaks to title and where that property will vest and who title will remain with at the conclusion of a contract. Now, there's an important full risk of loss alternate one to the basic government property clause. So you have your basic government property clause here, 52-245-1. If your contract also includes Alt 1 after the basic clause, so it'll say 52-251-1, Alt 1, you really need to take note of that. Generally speaking, the government acknowledges that loss, theft, damage, destruction, things like that occur, and the government is willing to accept risk of that loss of property, normal wear and tear, things of that nature, when the basic clause is included. If the Alt 1 of the basic clause is included, that means the government is not willing to accept risk of any damage, loss, theft, destruction of any property that's in your possession as a contractor. It means the contractor will be required to replace and or reimburse the government for any loss, theft, damage, destruction that happens to any property, whether furnished or acquired, in its possession. So it's important to identify, particularly in solicitations, if that property is going to be inclusive of Alt 1 and the full risk of loss. If it does include that, you very well likely are going to want to acquire insurance for the property that may be in your possession or that you might be buying to ensure that you have the ability to replace it if anything happens to it. So other government contracting clauses in Part 45, 45-2 talks about government property installation operation services. So this is when service contracts are going to be performed on government installation, and it governs who's responsible for managing the property on the government installations. Sometimes these are GovCos, government-owned, contractor-operated facilities. So look for that if you're in that kind of business. The other clause that is one of the three main clauses in Part 45 is 245-9, and that governs the use and charges associated with government property. So when this clause is included, it means that the contractor may use the government property either without charge, or the contractor has the ability to rent property that's the government's with prior approval and clearance. And that does require ACO approval. And if they are renting property from the government, if the contractor gets the approval and can rent, say, a large piece of machinery or equipment for use on a particular contract, particularly when you're operating on government installations, then there may be rental fees associated with that. And if you have to pay rental fees, it's important to understand that these fees are paid directly to Treasury, and they're not the equivalent of a refund or a credit against your contract. Those rental fees have to actually go directly to the Department of Treasury. So we talked about some FAR clauses. There's, for those of you that operate within the DoD space, so whether it's Army, Navy, Air Force, DHS, Health and Human Services within the Department of Defense, any of those sub-agencies, there's been changes as of January of 2024 to the government property clauses that you would ordinarily see in your government contracts. There's a new clause that was issued, and it's effective as of January 22nd, 2024, and it's management and reporting of government property. 252-245-7005. And what this clause does is it consolidates three of the previous clauses that existed, and it completely removes the fourth clause that existed. And so it takes the reporting of government property, loss of government property, and the reutilization and inventory disposal methods for government property and consolidates all of those clauses into the one parent clause now that exists in its stead as of January 22nd, 2024, the 245-7005 clause. Now, this clause takes effect for new contracts. If you have contracts that were awarded prior to January 22nd, 2024, you will still have these legacy clauses until that contract is complete. Or if the contract is modded to replace those clauses. That's the only way this new clause will be retroactively incorporated into any older contracts. So those clauses will stay in full force and effect until either that contract is complete or if a modification occurs where the government modifies it to remove those clauses and add the new clause. But going forward, this is going to be the new consolidated clause that you'll see for government property on your DoD contracts. It'll accompany the 52245-1 basic FAR clause as well. And so the requirements of all four clauses are really consolidated into this one clause now. In addition, there are some updated references in the clause for PCARS, the Plant Clearance Automated Reutilization Screening System, which used to be a separate website. And a class deviation existed for a few years, and also for the IUID model for the government reporting of government furnished property. So both of these items now, both PCARS and IUID, are both in POPI, and I have a screenshot for that I'll show you later on during the course. So let's talk about the government property life cycle. So in general, the government property life cycle follows a cyclical roundabout, if you will, from acquisition and receipt to physical inventory, stewardship, responsibility, accountability, relief of stewardship, reporting, utilization, maintenance, property in the control of your subcontractors and reporting that property, all the way through to property closeout. And there's three main segments to this life cycle. And it starts with the pre-award phase and then goes through the maintenance and administration of the post-award phase, which is really acquisition, all the way through to utilization, maintenance, and control and reporting. And then the third phase is your closeout phase. And we're going to hit on each of these discussion points now. So during the pre-award phase, this is when a solicitation may be distributed either via SAM or a broad agency announcement or something like that. And the government has specific responsibilities during the pre-award phase regarding government property. So if government property is anticipated at all on a particular contract or contract award, the solicitation should describe what the evaluation procedures are, and they should disclose any kind of government property that's anticipated to be furnished on that particular subsequent contract award. And the reason why they would include this in the solicitation is because you don't want any unfair advantage towards an incumbent contractor versus a contractor that's openly competing for the subsequent award or the recompete. For example, if there is a piece of equipment on that's been furnished on a contract and the incumbent knows that that equipment is there and they can use it, that would be an advantage to them knowing that during a solicitation where another contractor might say, oh, I'm going to have to go and purchase that equipment. And so their price would be artificially higher, not knowing that that particular piece of equipment is going to be furnished for use on the particular contract. So it's full and open disclosure. The planning requirements have to be there. The property analyst on the government side has to coordinate with the procuring contracting officer to make sure that any property is identified and included. There should be a list or a description of the property that it proposes to use on the contract, whether or not that's going to be acquired or furnished. It should include dates that the property will be available for use. If there's any kind of rental income that's expected on the use of the property by the contractor, that should be included in the solicitation. And the property management plan should be disclosed. Sometimes your property management plan is part of your formal response to the solicitation, your proposal, and sometimes the property management plan is evaluated post-award. It just depends on the solicitation. But definitely specifically the responsible parties need to be identified, and the costs for making government property available would be included in that solicitation as well. So the contractor's responsibility during the pre-award phase is definitely making sure that your property management plan is up to date. That means that your policy, your procedure relative to government property is integrated, fully in place and implemented throughout your company or your division. And again, you don't need to have a special plan specifically for property that's being used on government contracts. However, you do need to make sure that your plan addresses the elements that are delineated in the property management guidebook that's published by DCMA. With regards to that guidebook, a new version was recently published in May of 2024, so it's a couple months old now. There's a full description on the front end of the property management guidebook that explains what's been updated and what's changed. Most of the updates pertain to the government's responsibility with regards to managing property on their end and administering the property, and also the property management system assessment. However, there have been some updates regarding to timeliness and dates specifically for the 22 elements that are in the PMSA as well. And if we go back to the basic clause for responsibility of government property with regards to the contractor, it specifically says that the contractor shall initiate and maintain the processes, systems, procedures, records, and methodologies necessary, consistent with voluntary consensus standards, for handling property that's in your possession. And so it's a requirement that's derived both from Part 45 and then specifically incorporated into your contract via the Basic Property Management Clause. So what happens during the post-award phase? This is the phase where property is administered, managed, maintained, utilized. You will conduct inventories, you'll do reporting, you'll identify excess property, you'll identify property that you may or may permit to be in your subcontractor's possession. Any property that's in your subcontractor's possession is the requirement of the prime contractor. So the government's eyes is that the prime contractor will act as if they are the equivalent of the government CO when it comes to managing property that might be in your subcontractor's possession, and any reporting that you do for government property has to be at the prime level. So you'll need to make sure that you have mechanisms in place to collect inventory records, status records of any property that you allow your subcontractors to either acquire or have in their possession. So let's talk about also how property comes into the possession of a contractor to begin with. Before I talked about loosely gaining contracts and losing contracts, and that contractor acquired property when transferred to another contract is converted to government furnished property. So property can either be issued from stock, it can be leased by the government and then furnished to the contractor. That's still considered government property, government furnished property for the contractor's perspective, even if the government's leasing it. And sometimes property can be transferred. So it can be transferred from the government to a contractor as government furnished property. It can be transferred from one contractor to a completely different contractor via a contract mod to both the losing and the gaining contract. Or it can be transferred from a contract in one contractor's perspective possession to another contract that's in that very same contractor's possession. And so what happens when you have a contract to contract or a contractor to contractor transfer is that any contractor acquired property on a losing contract that is then transferred to a gaining contract, whether it's to a new contractor or a contract within that same contractor's organization, that cap, once it's theoretically transferred back to the government and reissued on that new contract, that cap then transfers and becomes government furnished property once that report is sent to the government. And this is agnostic regarding whether or not the property physically changes location. And so what I mean by is if you have a piece of equipment at your facility and you no longer have need for that equipment on your government contract and you purchase that equipment on your government contract, you will then let the government know I have excess government property, and the government will provide disposition methods. One of the items that the contractor is supposed to do when reporting excess is let the government know if there's any reutilization that could be taken advantage of for that piece of property. So if you purchased equipment on contract A and you said, hey, contracting officer, I actually could also use this equipment on contract B that I have here in my same facility, can we transfer the property from contract A to contract B? The government may very well provide disposition instructions that says, yes, you can transfer it. So they'll modify contract A and remove the government property, and then they will modify contract B and add the government property to that contract. And contract B is now going to be the steward of the property on that contract. And so via those modifications, even though the equipment didn't actually physically transfer locations, when it was modified, the contract A was modified and contract B was modified, that's when the contractor acquired property transitioned into government furnished property on contract B. And that makes a difference because of how we're going to report on it at the end of the contract. And we'll talk about that in just a couple of slides. And so it's important to know that whenever there always has to be one accountable contract. And so you may get permission from a contracting officer that a particular piece of equipment could be used on both, let's say, two contracts. One contract is going to be the steward of the property. So the property will be issued to one contract, and that contract is where that property is accountable and reported to. And the government would have to modify that contract to allow for use on a secondary contract that is not the owning contract of that property. So there's always a one-to-one relationship when it comes to contracts and government property, in that they're reportable via only one contract. So we talked about losing contract and gaining contract and the transfer of government property. But it's important to understand the contract type when you're determining whether contractor acquired property is in fact government property or not. So there are certain situations when property can be obtained on a particular contract, but the government does not have any vesting interest in the title to that particular contract. So on any cost type contract or T&M contract, whenever there is a reimbursable CLIN on your contract and government monies are used to acquire property on that particular CLIN, and the government reimburses you for the purchase of those items on that reimbursable CLIN, the government will always have vesting interests in the title to that property. And the property will always be the property of the government at the end of the contract on those cost CLINs, or those reimbursable CLINs, to which a contractor is entitled to reimbursement. On fixed price contracts, it's a little bit different. Fixed price contracts, by nature, you're only going to get a fixed amount of money for that particular contract, and the risk of performance falls upon the contractor. Whereas on reimbursable contractors, the risk of performance falls more squarely on the government. On fixed price contracts, the contractor will retain title to all property acquired on the contract that's used unless it's specifically identified as a deliverable end item to the government. And so what that means is, in your statement of work, in your contract, there will be CLINs, and it will specifically identify any property that's purchased on that contract to which the government intends to take possession. A great example of this would be that, if you had to procure a special laptop that had the ability to run sophisticated algorithms, or had to be able to handle some sort of special software that's loaded on it so that you can run those special algorithms. If the results of those tests or algorithms and the laptop that it's run on to produce those results are listed as part of the deliverable, then the government is going to have a vested interest in that laptop, because it's specifically required in order to view the results of those algorithms that you're running or developing during the course of contract performance. Another example where the title to contractor acquired property would not transfer to the government would be if you have a deliverable, and your deliverables are for reports. So you're going to do some testing. And in order to do your testing, you're going to have to acquire some test fixtures and have them manufactured so that you can go ahead and run the tests that you need to run, or perform the simulations. And if the deliverable says that the deliverable to the government in support of this firm fixed price contract is to provide those results and a report, well, then any kind of test fixtures that you had to buy to perform those tests would not be part of those deliverables to the government. So it wouldn't transfer to the government. The test fixtures would remain the property of the contractor at the close of the contract. So it's really important to understand the contract type and what that means to the contractor as to whether or not any contractor acquired property is actually going to stay as the contractor's property, or whether it's going to transfer and become property of the government at the end of the contract. So also during the post-award phase, I said it's maintenance, administration, reporting. So the status of government property must be maintained throughout the life cycle of the property and the contract. That includes where it's currently located, where it's placed in use. It includes maintenance records, utilization records. If it's removed out of storage or placed in storage, you need all of those movement records have to be tracked. If it's retired, if it's identified as excess, if it's disposed of in accordance with government issued disposition methods, all of that has to be retained in your property management system. And it doesn't mean that you have to have a specific software or a specific IT platform with which to handle it. I've seen everything from spreadsheets to sophisticated SAP systems. As long as you have a process and you are consistent with how that process is implemented and maintained, however you do it and however you disclose it in your property management plan, your property management policies and procedures, that's perfectly okay as long as it's documented and you're consistent in its implementation. So I hit on inventory. Inventory is required for government property at least annually. Typically, at the start of a contract, you'll conduct a physical inventory of any accountable property that you have on the contract, and then you'll either do your inventories quarterly, biannually, or annually. At least they have to be done annually. If it's a follow-on contract and an incumbent is transferring property to a new contractor who won the recompete, typically there'll be a startup inventory at the time of transfer. And then sometimes that'll be done jointly between both the incoming and the outgoing contractors together. They'll do a joint wall-to-wall inventory, and they'll identify any discrepancies with the government furnished property listing in the contract so that the government contracting officer can modify that list on the contract. Inventory always has to include your decal number or tag number, any manufacturer name, manufacturer model. If the item's serialized, you'll have to include the serial number as well. So inventory of government property always includes all government property. So contractor acquired government property and should always be based on the requirements within the contract. So where might the requirements in the contract be? Well, typically the requirements are going to stem from your basic property management clause, your 52245-1, and if you're a DoD contractor, that consolidated 7005 clause that's been implemented now post-January of this year. Your inventory should always be done in accordance with the contractor's established practices. So what does that mean? It means whatever you have in your property management plan that governs how you're going to do inventory, whether it's going to be sampling, wall-to-wall inventories, the frequency of the inventory, all of that should be consistently performed in accordance with your documented procedures. And if your procedures are incorrect or you need to deviate from them, then that means you need to update your procedures, and those procedures need to be reviewed annually as well. The inventory is going to have to disclose the type of property that's being inventoried, how it's being used. Inventory procedures should make sure that the property is used only in performance to the contract under which it is assigned. You cannot use government property outside of its specific assignment. And what that means is if you have government property in your possession, it means you cannot use that government property on one of your commercial jobs. So a project that you have with a commercial company where, oh, it would be great if I could use this property on that. Well, you're not allowed to. Government property can only be used on the contract to which it's assigned. It also means that unless you have some sort of dual use modification or clause within your contract award, you can't use government property on another contract unless both of those contracts are modified to allow the use of it. So use of government property is strictly limited to the contract to which it's assigned. Any property that you have that is sensitive, it should be marked as sensitive, and then it will be handled separately outside of your GenPop inventory practices. And then finally, your inventory report. This is where you will you'll let the government know you did your inventory. After contract close, you would always have to do an inventory. We'll talk about that. But you'll record or reconcile any discrepancies, identify any overages or any shortages or anything that's been lost or damaged or destroyed or missing. You'll do your research. You'll include the name of the property contract and the contact in the report, particularly if you have an assigned property administrator to your company or your specific cage. And then all of the inventory report, including any subcontractor inventory, would have to be in one consolidated report that you deliver to the government. So we talked about, receiving government property, property that can be in subcontractors' possession and how that works. We talked about doing inventories. We talked about reporting. There are different roles for the government and contractor during this post-award contract lifecycle maintenance and administration phase during the execution of your actual contract. Typically, the contractor program manager is going to be the responsible party who has the active role of monitoring property on the contract, making sure the records are okay, putting together and reviewing the inventory reports, making sure that excess property is identified and disclosed to the government timely and accurately. The government property administrator is the one who's going to provide the guidance on actual physical inventories that the government might want to perform and any kind of property management system assessment that might occur. The property administrator informs the contracting officer on risks and property that is on the contract and the maintenance of the property on the contract. The contracting officer on the government side serves as a liaison between the actual property administrator and the program manager, the contractor, and the government property liaison. And the contracting officer is also responsible for monitoring the contractor's performance, which includes performance under any surveillance, which would be akin to your property management system assessment or any limited property management assessment that might occur. If you have a deficient property management system, the contracting officer can deny the use of property on your contract or could impose the Alt 1 full risk of loss clause on your contract in order to decrease the risk to the government when there is property in your possession. So we talked about inventory, and inventory is part of the closeout process, which is required on all government contracts that have property on them. So contractors are normally assigned the task of actual property disposal. So the government oversees the disposal process. The government provides direction on what the disposal method should be and what should happen to property that's remaining on a contract at the end of contract, but they typically direct the contractor to actually take care of the disposition of the property. It's also the contractor's responsibility to report the property at the end of the contract. So after the contract is physically complete, the contractor has a requirement to disclose to the government any property that's remaining on the contract and provide any recommended reutilization methods that they might be aware of. As in the other scenario that we talked about, if you have another contract that could benefit from the use of the contract, you could certainly make that kind of recommendation at that point. The basic clause provides the approval and disposition procedures and assigns oversight and ultimate decision authority to the government. So in FAR Part 45.6, there's an entire section that talks about reporting, reutilization, and disposal. And it establishes the policy for reporting and what the government's supposed to do and what the contractor's supposed to do in order to find a new home or to rehome property that's remaining at the end of a contract award. It does not apply to the disposal of real property. Real property is handled completely separately outside of FAR Part 45. So some of the disposition methods include internal evaluation for reutilization within the agency itself. So if you're an HHS will say, hey, do we have other contracts within our agency that would benefit from the use of this property? And if they don't, then they could consider transfer outside of their agency to another agency, also transfer to GSA for repurposing. And so all of this has timelines that are discussed, and it all stems from the initial requirement of the contractor to report the excess inventory remaining at the end of contract performance, so that the government can then do their internal analysis to determine what to do with the property, and whether or not it could be reutilized, repurposed within the agency or outside the agency. And if it can't be reutilized or repurposed, then they'll provide disposition methods on how to dispose of the property. And so there's different ways that the government will provide direction on how to dispose of property that is in the contractor's possession. It's important to note, though, that contractors cannot dispose of any government property in their possession unless they're provided specific, definitive, written instruction by the contracting officer, not just the property administrator, providing authorization for you to go ahead and dispose of that property that is in your possession. And there's different methods that you can use. Sometimes the government will just abandon the property, and what that means is they're just going to leave it at your facility and say we're abandoning it, and that means that the contractor is able to do with it as they see fit once they receive the abandonment instructions. If they have a need to use it on a commercial job, you can use it at that point on a commercial job. You could use it on another government job. If the government issues abandonment disposition methods, that means that you can throw it away. You can do whatever you want with it as a contractor. If the government if the contractor has sensitive property on their contract, the government cannot abandon it unless the contractor agrees to the abandonment. So if it's not sensitive, the government can just say we're abandoning it, and then it's up to the contractor. If it's sensitive property, subject to clearance and things like that, the contractor has to agree to the abandonment prior to the government doing so. If it is something that could potentially be put up for sale, or if it's scrap and you can send it to a scrap yard and sell it, then the government can give you disposition methods to go ahead and sell the property, and then any proceeds will get credited back to the contract. If you can't sell it, sometimes the government will ask you to destroy it. So, for example, the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan, there was a lot of government property that was left there. And so at the time when the contractors who were in theater were there, they would have been given disposition methods to destroy the property. And so when you destroy property, you have to render it unfit for use in its original capacity. So if it's a weapon, you would go ahead and dismantle and break it and destroy it so that it can't be reassembled, and then fulfill its function as a weapon in whatever capacity that would be. Communication of contracts outside the United States, they have to be in writing. Anything outside the United States has to be in writing. Within the United States, for disposition methods, you really, really, really want to have your disposition instructions reduced to writing, even if they're orally disclosed at the beginning. So the government can say, the contracting officer can say, I want you to see if you could sell this surplus equipment, or I want to see if you can sell the scraps to a scrap yard and get some sort of credit that we can credit to your indirect rates or something like that. If they say that and provide that oral direction, you then want to reduce that oral direction to writing within 30 days of receipt of that oral direction. Contracts outside the United States, though, you cannot do anything until that direction is provided in writing. Inventory disposal reports. The most common one is the 1424. That's the disposition of the property identified on your inventory disposal schedule. That's the most common. However, during the course of your contract, you might have to report any property in your possession that you no longer have a need for, and that's considered excess personal property. And so you're supposed to submit a report on any excess personal property in your possession within 21 days following identification that the property is excess in nature. There's also inventory verification surveys and other inventory schedules. These forms are all located in FAR Part 53 with all the other forms that exist for the government. A lot of these forms have been overcome by system updates. For example, PI for closeout, both government furnished property both contractor acquired property is what used to be PCARs, and also government furnished property that was reported to the IUID registry. These registries are both now located within PI, which is the Procurement Integrated Enterprise environment that most DoD contractors are familiar with. So those are reported directly through PI. Sometimes there are agency memorandums of understanding where other agencies will leverage this system as well. Otherwise, many of the other agencies still rely on the old-fashioned forms that are located in Part 53 of the FAR. So at the time of contract closeout, the contractor is required to do a formal final inventory, and this covers all property, both furnished and acquired, under the contract, including any non-expendable and expendable property, regardless of cost. And so if items are consumed during the contract, you'd have to identify them as consumed. If they're physically located somewhere, you'll have to put the disposition status of the property. The final contract closeout also includes any credits. It'll include all the the property in your subcontractor's possession. You have to notify the property administrator assigned to your contract. And if there is no property administrator, the contracting officer then, of any discrepancies in your inventory. And any failure to provide a timely final inventory can result in a delay, an excusable delay by the government of your final payment on the contract. So it's very important that you're timely with your final report, final inventory report to the government. In this final inventory report, as I noted before, you can make recommendations on any reutilization of property that's otherwise not consumed. And if the government terminates your contract for convenience, you would have to provide a termination inventory that's very much akin to the actual final inventory that you would do for ordinary closeout procedures. During the closeout, you also need to provide the disposition status of the property, as I mentioned. And for cost reimbursement contracts, there's different disposition methods that are available to the contractor than on fixed price contracts. Specifically, if there's any contractor acquired property that is surplus, the government can request that the contractor buy back that contractor acquired property at 100% of the acquisition value. If it's items that are coming from inventory, the government can request that the contractor return items to inventory for either restocking credit or to the supplier for full credit. They can also request transfers, as you could for a fixed price contract as well. For HHS, they could also require that you return the inventory to HHS, or that you report it as excess and find alternative disposition options. And lastly, the government may consider additional options, including sale to the public and abandonment or scrapping, as we discussed before. These are all perfectly within the purview of the government for a contract closeout. So IUID data requirements and PCARS data requirements. PCARS, as I said, and IUID are both now in PI. IUID is the reporting of government furnished property that's in your possession. You're required to specifically for DoD contracts, you're required to report your government furnished property at the end of the contract to the IUID registry. For contractor acquired property, you're required to report it through PCARS. And that's the plant clearance automated reutilization screening system, so that the government can then take inventory of what kind of contractor acquired property is remaining on your contract and try to reutilize it in some capacity. It's important to note that when you're reporting to PCARS any contractor acquired property, that if you are reporting an item that includes expendable items that have been incorporated into a higher end design, that you report the inventory on PCARS at the highest level, including all of the costs of the subordinate elements that went into that piece of equipment. So what I'm saying is, if you manufactured something and it included screws and bolts and chips and all sorts of things that you purchased that are otherwise consumables or expendable property, but they were incorporated into this higher end piece of equipment, you would report the total value of the equipment to PCARS, including labor, overhead, and all of the sub-elements that went into the manufacture of that piece of equipment. And so with that, we are at 11 o'clock. So Joshua Lee, I believe you had some polling questions.
Yes, I do. I'm going to go ahead and put up a couple true or false. Make sure you guys are participating if you are seeking credit today. First, true or false. Agencies will not generally require contractors to establish property management systems that are separate from the oops, it looks like that cut off. Do you have the polling questions in front of you?
Yes, let me pull them up real quick.
So,
Okay, the first polling question is, agencies will not generally require contractors to establish property management systems that are separate from the contractor's established procedures.
thanks so much, Christina. I'll give you guys a few moments to send the answer through. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Looks like we've got 70% saying true, 30% selecting false.
So the answer is true. Agencies will not generally require contractors to establish separate property management systems. They encourage contractors to use voluntary consensus standards as the basis of it, and then just overlay additional requirements onto their system that they have. So the second polling question is true or false. Title to property purchased on firm fixed price contracts always remains with the contractor.
I'll give you guys about a minute.
I'll read it again. Title to property purchased on firm fixed price contracts always remains with the contractor.
Alright, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Looks like we've got 30% selecting true and 70% selecting false.
So the answer here is false. Title to property purchased on firm fixed price contracts will remain with the contractor unless it is included as an end deliverable to the government. So if the deliverable item includes the property that you purchased on it, then it has to be delivered to the government, and title to that property will vest with the government. Any other property that is not listed as a deliverable to the government will vest with the contractor and remain with the contractor. So the third polling question is also true or false. Contractors must physically mark all property, including consumable property.
I'll give you guys a moment. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. Looks like we've got 49% choosing true, 51% choosing false.
Yeah, this one's a little bit harder. I didn't specifically speak to indelible marking, but it was in the slides. And so contractors are required to physically mark all government property that is accountable. And consumable property is considered expendable, so it doesn't have book value accountability at the individual level. And so, no, the answer is false. You do not have to physically mark consumable property. And that's largely because a lot of times you physically cannot mark consumable property. It's going to be incorporated into some higher end of design, or in the case of hydrogen, you can't mark hydrogen or chemicals and things like that. So consumables do not require that kind of identifiable mark. And so, Joshua, while you're looking to see if there's extra questions, I did want to let everyone know that I understand title to government property, like we were talking about with the true-false question on fixed price contracts, can be a little confusing. So I included an extra section on title to government property and when it transfers. And I also included both a government property compliance section that includes the audit program for your property management system assessment, and also goes through the 22 PMSA elements that exist in your property management system assessment that are found in the DCMA guidebook for property management.
Interesting, we do have quite a few questions. I'm going to go ahead and start with our first question for Mary. Can you give a specific example of durable property?
Yeah, so durable property is property that doesn't have book value accountability because either its useful life is, I'm sorry, durable property is property that would otherwise be considered expendable, but because of its unique characteristics, it either has a useful life of excess of a year, or uh, it has book value accountability that's $50 or higher. So typically, you'll have things that can last. So tools. Think of a carpenter or a welder or a plumber. They have wrenches, they have hammers, they have screwdrivers. These things are less than $50, so typically they don't have book value accountability. However, because they do last for more than a year, they're considered durable. And so they'll be identified with a D, and you're not supposed to dispose of them as if they're consumable because they do have a useful life of more than a year. So things of that nature that are lower dollar value items, but because they do have a useful life of more than a year, they're considered durable, and they require book value accountability and tracking.
Interesting. Our next question, what is software classified as?
Software, I'm sorry, did you say what is software classified as?
Yes.
Software is not considered government property. It's handled under intellectual property in the FAR, and so it's governed by that section and not by Part 45.
And does that include software licenses?
Yes.
Thanks so much. Our next question. Can you speak to special tooling and test equipment? Is this always government property regardless of contracted type?
Special tooling or special test equipment, so either ST or STE, it's just another form of property. It could be contractor acquired property or it could be government furnished property. Usually tooling or test equipment, one example is if you're in the engineering realm, you might have sputtering machines or magnetron sputtering machines, or you might have some sort of machinery that that places coatings on things, or special tooling to do riveting in boats or in aircraft and things like that. So it depends on how the contractor comes into possession of it. If it's furnished by the government, then it's always going to belong to the government. If it is acquired by the contractor, then it depends on the contract type. If it's acquired on a reimbursable plan, a cost plan, a T&M type plan, then the government's going to have title to it, and it will be delivered back to the government, and it's the title will vest with the government, and you'll have to do full inventory reporting on it. If it's purchased on a fixed price contract and it's not listed as a deliverable to the government in any form of way, then that tooling or test equipment will remain the property of the contractors at the close of the contract.
Thanks, Christine. Our next question. Your slide on durable property said it does not require book accountability. Can you
Say that
clarify
again,
that?
please.
Your slide on durable property said it does not require book accountability, but that is not what you said.
Yes, so well, maybe there's a typo on there. So durable property is a form of expendable property. So expendable property does not require book value accountability, but if it's marked with a D, then it is considered durable. And so because of that, you're going to track it, even though it doesn't have the minimum $50 book value accountability. You're still gonna be required to maintain records of it.
Interesting. Our next question. Please clarify if you have to track or book durable property.
Yes, you have to track it. So durable property will be specifically identified in your contract with a D. It'll be listed and it'll have a D next to it. And if it's durable, then it requires tracking.
Interesting. Next question. 45.103. If we have our own system to manage inventory, do we have to use a GFP as well?
If you have your own system, your own inventory management system, you're not required to have a separate system for property that's in your possession. Now, if you're saying GFP, that's government furnished property. So that wouldn't be part of your inventory system because by nature it's not inventory. So you would have to have some sort of additional mechanisms in addition to your inventory system where you're going to be tracking and managing the property. If your inventory system is an asset management system and it has the ability to load assets, you could load your government furnished property into your asset management system and then track it that way, and that would be perfectly acceptable. But government furnished property by definition is just not inventory. You're not taking it out of your inventory seals. The government's issuing it to you on a contract. So whether you're going to add that to your system as a separate item that's going to be specifically tagged and kept in a cage in a secure facility that's tagged as government furnished property, that depends on the capability of your software system. But you do not need a separate system to track specifically government furnished property if you have one that already has the capability of doing so.
Thank you. Our next question, FAR 52.245-2, when a service provided in conjunction with the contractor acquired product. I'm not sure I understand the question, Christopher. If you're still on, maybe you can give a little bit more clarification. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. Should intellectual property purchase, such as software or software licenses, be included in contract closeout inventory?
No.
Thanks so much. Next question. If I am purchasing on behalf of government and immediately deliver the material to the government customer, do I need to create a DD Form 1149, which shows transfer of ownership from contractor to the government?
So in this case, I think they're saying that it's getting drop shipped to the government directly. In that case, when the government receives the property, that'll be the receiving record. So typically, you don't need to have additional forms as if you're transferring something back to the government because you never had it in your possession. It's a unique situation, but that does happen. I know the Navy does that, where they'll have a contractor purchase, a whole bunch of computers or laptops or something, and then drop ship them. So you should not have to have a separate form for that. Upon receipt of the government, that'll be part of the receiving record, and typically that's going to happen on a cost cleanse. So it'll be immediately. Once it's in the government's possession, title would have transferred. So you should be okay on that. The government ordinarily will not require separate reporting on that. But if you have a specific question, I would contact your contracting officer. Every contracting officer does things a little bit differently. I'll say that in my experience, you haven't had to have that form. In addition, when it's drop shipped directly to the government, but sometimes contracting officers might want additional paperwork. So definitely check in with them.
Alrighty, we do have another question. If the government gives dispensation to the contractor to dispose of contractor-acquired property, may the contractor make use of the property by repurposing the product or sell the excess property under FAR 45.604?
Yeah, so if the disposition instructions are such that they abandon it, then yes, you can repurpose it or use it however you want. If the disposition instructions are that it has to be thrown out or discarded, or that it has to be sold for scrap or something else, then no, you can't repurpose it. You have to follow the disposition instructions as provided. So for your question, if they abandoned it, then yes, you would be able to repurpose it. If they did not abandon it and they provided specific instructions to either sell it or do something else, you actually have to follow those disposition instructions and you would not be able to repurpose it.
Thanks, Christine. I do see that we have hit 2:15. I know some people might have to hop off. I'm not sure if you want to take additional questions or we can send the remainder of the questions to you.
How many more questions do we have?
We've got about 7 or 8.
Yeah, I'll stay on. We can keep answering, and then if people have to hop off, they can hop off.
Sounds great. Thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and continue with the questions. Is there any way that contractor can legally get around complying with all of this minutiae?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Is there any way that contractors can legally get around with complying? I'm not sure I understand the question, Frank. If you
I
would
think
like
they're
to.
asking if they can not comply with the requirements and have it be legal. And the short answer is no. If the property clause is in your contract, then you have to comply with it.
Thanks so much. Our next question is an email from the contracting officer stating they wish us to destroy materials at the end of the contract sufficient?
Yes. You need to maintain that email, so add it to your record, your closeout folder. and that would be the disposition instructions. And so as long as the email came from the contracting officer, only the officer, the contracting officer, the warranted contracting officer, has the ability to provide disposition instructions. So if the email came from your contracting officer or your ACO, and they provided the disposition instructions, then that's sufficient.
Thank you. Our next question, what about a FFP service contract that involved purchase of furniture, security items, etc.? Contract has 52-245-1. Does the government have title?
So the government would only have title to the items if it's included as a deliverable in the contract. So you'll want to go into your contract and look at your performance work statement or your statement of work. And if it lists deliverables, and those deliverables include those security items or the furniture that you procured, then those items will be, the title to those items will vest in the government. If those items are not listed in your contract as deliverable items to the government, then they are not, the government does not have title to it, and the contractor will own that at the end of contract performance.
Thanks, Christine. Our next question, what if the contract type is a hybrid contract, example FP or TNM?
Yeah, so if it's a hybrid, then you basically both contract types and vesting methodologies apply. So on the firm fixed price CLIN, if they're deliverables that include items that are contractor acquired, then those items would be, the title to those items will vest with the government. If there are no items listed in the FFP CLIN as deliverables to the government, then anything purchased on that CLIN would be the contractors. On the material CLIN, the reimbursable CLIN, whether it's a cost no fee, cost plus fee, or just a material CLIN, if anything purchased on that CLIN, the government's going to have title to. So as soon as you submit your invoice for reimbursement of those items, title will begin vesting with the government to all of those items purchased on that reimbursable CLIN.
Thanks, Christine. Our next question, for FFP, when does title take place? During the POP or after POP, when the contract is billed, paid for complete?
Title transfers at the time of delivery. So if you have a firm fixed price contract and your first deliverable is delivery of, let's say, a rack of computer servers and the results of user acceptance testing, for example, then at the time of delivery of that rack and the user acceptance results, that's when title will transfer to the government. Even if the rack of computer servers is not physically transferred to the government, once you submit that deliverable to the government, that's when title transfers to the government. So title to that rack would belong to the government at that point. So that would be during the period of performance. If the items are procured on a firm fixed price contract and there is no deliverable that requires you to transfer those items, then title to the items purchased during the POP is going to vest with the contractor and then will remain the contractor's, and title will remain with the contractor at the end of the period of performance.
Thanks, Christine. Our next question, is a managed service by the contractor, with whom does the property responsibility rest? With the contractor or the government if the property is in operation on the government's premise?
So if you're doing managed services, like for the Department of Energy, they outsource to contractors management of a lot of their facilities. Unless that the property is in your contract, then responsibility for that property is going to remain with the government on the government facility. If it's part of your contract, though, to maintain the property at the facility, then chances are that property is going to be incorporated by reference or location into your contract, and then all the maintenance and utilization records will be the responsibility of the contractor.
Thanks, Christina. Next question. Are 45.103 and 252.24-7005 in conflict of each other?
No. So the way the FAR and agency supplements work, agency supplements can be more stringent than, but cannot conflict with the FAR. So FAR is Chapter 1 of Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations. The DFAR is Chapter 2 of Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So the requirements of 252-245-7005 are going to be more stringent than what's included in Part 45, but they cannot conflict with it.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was our final question, and I believe that concludes our Q&A.
Okay.
With that, I am going to go ahead, as always. We'd love to know how we did today. All feedback is greatly appreciated. If you guys have any further questions, feel free to send them through. We are more than happy to follow up. Make sure you guys check out PCI's website for our upcoming programs. And thank you so much, Christine, for a wonderful session.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You as well, everyone.